Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our second interdisciplinary Japanese studies research webinar of this new semester. My name is Simon Kaner. I'm the director of the Centre for Japanese Studies at the University of East Anglia. And I know that as well as many of our students at UEA, we have many participants in various parts of the world joining us this lunchtime, and you are all very welcome. We have two wonderful guests who are going to be giving us presentations on our theme of disaster memory today. We're marking two, or we're sort of in the process of building up to marking two important disaster scenarios, which certainly are deserving of memorialization. Just 10 years ago, of course, we had the Great East Japan disaster, and 25 years ago, we had the Sarin gas attacks on the Tokyo Underground. And I know we're going to be hearing about both of those, and we'll be thinking over the course of the next little while about how we can continue the Sainsbury Institute and our Centre for Japanese Studies involvement in a project that we call cultural properties loss, and the impact that these kind of disasters can have on cultural properties in Japan, and indeed more widely than that, over the longer term. But that will be something that will be entertaining us. Well, that be something we'll be giving thought to over the coming academic year. So this today's seminar is a way of kicking that off. I'm going to hand over to my colleague now, Dr. Nadine Willems, who is going to introduce our first speaker for us. And then we're going to be handing over, once Richard Lloyd-Parry has given his presentation, we're going to be handing over to Ollie Moxham in the Sainsbury Institute, who's going to introduce our second speaker. So I will see you all just before 2 o'clock. We will get wrapped up by 2, but now over to Nadine. Thank you very much.
So yes, I'm Nadine Willems, and I'm the lecturer in Japanese history here at the University of East Anglia. And I speak now as a historian of modern Japan. And I just would like to go back first to the very early 20th century, when in April 1901, the writer and social reformer Uchimura Kanzo traveled to Ashikaga in Tochigi Prefecture, north of Tokyo, to observe the effects of pollution caused by the over-exploitation of the Ashio copper mine, the first major environmental disaster in the era of modernization. And on his return, Uchimura wrote the following: "There are many kinds of disasters in the world, such as earthquakes, tsunami, and floods. These disasters are not so different from one another in that they are not difficult to resign oneself to. And the most difficult disasters to endure are not those naturally occurring, but those created by men. Natural calamities are impossible to avoid. Man-made calamities can be avoided. Moreover, mining pollution affects the next generations, and it creates untold misery." So Japan's experience with natural disasters over the centuries has arguably shaped its culture and mindset, and communities adopt a different outlook on life and adapt differently to their environment when the possibility of nature's wrath is omnipresent. And also, although not entirely absent from the modern period, man-made disasters have expanded in scope and intensity during the country's drive for industrialization. And anyone familiar with the history of modern Japan will have heard of not only of the Ashio incident, but also the so-called 4 big diseases generated by industrial pollution, the most well-known of them being the Minamata disease, the poisoning with methyl mercury, and the horrendous deformities and disabilities caused by the indirect ingestion of methyl mercury via the food chain. But I think the Ashio incident remains a seminal moment in the history of disasters. It was the first of its kind in terms of scales and consequence. I'm mentioning this now because one man in particular stood in defiance of the treatment by the authorities of this disaster, and he was Tanaka Shozo, the leader of the anti-pollution campaign, who sided with the peasants and became a symbol of resistance and to bureaucratic intransigence. And I'm mentioning him now because his name resurfaced on several occasions at the time of the march 2011 triple disaster. He was more than simply an activist. He was someone who deeply reflected on the man-nature interaction. And this is a very long introduction to saying that I have reread Richard's wonderful book, The Ghost of the Tsunami. And of course, Richard deals with the effect of the tsunami itself, which is a natural disaster. But I also came to think that this distinction between natural and man-made disaster is easily blurred. And as natural as a disaster can be, and the tsunami was certainly so, the immediate response by the community and post-disaster management by are man-made and of crucial importance. I'm thinking, of course, here about the plight of this Okawa primary school, about which you, Richard, talked with such wonderful sensitivity. And I really, really thought it was important the way you talked about this. But very quickly, of course, the question of responsibility arises. And these are issues that will likely shape the memory of the disaster. And there is something else in Ghost of the Tsunami that I find so relevant, and it is how much listening to those affected by a disaster should be part of the recovery process and the creation of a collective memory. And I wonder whether memory is ever complete when some voices have not been heard. And that is valid for both natural and man-made disasters, of course. I'm not going to go much longer. I was not expected to introduce you, Richard, with all your long history of achievements writing books, but I think the Ghost of the Tsunami came in 2017 or 2016. So a few years after the actual disaster, but it's a long process, particularly of listening to people and going to the sites of this disaster. And it's not so much an inspection than an absorption of all these voices. And I thought that was extremely important, actually, for the shaping of that memory. And of course, for those who don't know, Richard is the Asia editor of the Times, based in Tokyo, but I think everybody really knows who you are. So I'm going to leave it at this and give it to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nadine. It's a great pleasure to be virtually with you this evening in Tokyo and to talk about disasters, because my experience of Japan as a foreigner and as a journalist has been defined in many ways by disasters of different kinds. I moved permanently to Tokyo on the 23rd of March, 1995, which was 3 days after the Sarin nerve gas attack on the Tokyo subway by the Aum Shinrikyo cult, which we'll be hearing about next from Mark Pendleton. And of course, that was an extraordinary, unprecedented event, an amazing story for a newly arrived young reporter as I was. But it was one in a series of catastrophes of different kinds that occurred in Japan that year. Just 2 months earlier, you'll remember in January, there'd been the Kobe earthquake, what in Japan is called the Hanshin earthquake. And those two events, one a human act of terrorism and the other, the second, a natural disaster, seemed to us, even at the time, very resonant. They were more than just a bizarre crime and a shifting of the seismic plates. They seemed even then to symbolize a wider emerging sense of malaise in Japan at that time. And it was a malaise that was related to economic change, but also to the country's broader sense of its identity in the post-war world and its place in the community of nations. And there are all kinds of discussions one could have on this very wide subject. But what I want to go into a bit now is the way in which natural and industrial disasters are tied up with the crisis of politics and identity that continues to afflict Japan, in my view, nearly 10 years after the 2011 disaster, which is the one that we're most focused on. So 1995, the other thing that was happening then was that the effects of the end of the so-called bubble economy were being felt, the period of high growth in the 1980s, which had actually come to an end 2 or 3 years earlier. But in 1995, it began to be felt in concrete ways. There were bankruptcies, there were corporate scandals. And after that, I remained a Tokyo-based correspondent reporting on Asia. And in many ways, my career since then has been measured out by natural disasters in Japan and other places. There were earthquakes in Russia and Indonesia that I covered, destructive cyclones in Burma and the Philippines. But of course, the most stunning and spectacular was the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami in the Indian Ocean, which killed 250,000 people in 14 countries, and which I reported on from Aceh in Indonesia. And I remember at the time thinking to myself that this was really, for all its horror, this was an extraordinary experience. This is something that a person can see only once every few generations. And then I went back to Japan, and 6 years later, it happened up the road from where I was living in northeast Japan. The Great East Japan disaster of March 2011, the earthquake and tsunami, which then set off the industrial disaster in the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. You all know what happened. Some of you, I know Professor Kano was there in Tokyo at the time. Tokyo was fine. It was a strong shake, but there were really only a handful of deaths or injuries. And I headed up there the next day and spent 2 weeks traveling up and down the coast, witnessing these scenes of extraordinary, unprecedented destruction. But the most impressive thing, in many ways as powerful as the destruction, was the survivors. Tens of thousands of people were crowded suddenly into schools, gymnasia, temples, shrines, anywhere there was space. And for the first few days, there was very little official help. People had to help themselves, which they did so with remarkable discipline and efficiency, allocating space, improvising bedding, preparing and distributing what food they have. There was, of course, chaos and confusion, but you'd go to these evacuation centers very early on and find a remarkable level of not only of organization, but of good humor and generosity, almost to a ridiculous extent. We would turn up as journalists in these improvised evacuation centers, which had food perhaps for a day, perhaps just for a few hours, and we would leave them laden with gifts of food. People who didn't have enough to eat ended up giving us, visitors, food to take away. And anyone who's lived in Japan knows how difficult it is to refuse gifts like that. There was no serious looting. I never saw fighting or squabbles or disagreement. There was no self-pity. And it was impossible not to make mental comparisons. When you go to a school gym when hundreds of people are living and sleeping literally head to toe, I found myself thinking, if this had happened in northeast England rather than in northeast Japan, people would be murdering one another by now. And I have nothing against northeast England, but you see the point about the social differences. During that first 2 weeks, there were terrible and fearful scenes and much sadness, but the horror was offset and almost eclipsed by the resilience and courage and decency of the victims of the disaster. And I think every foreign journalist who covered those events were struck by this. And I remember thinking at the time that this is the best of Japan. This is the best of humanity. This is one of the things that I love and admire most about this country, the calm, practical power and strength of communities. And I remember also thinking at the time about Japanese history and about those moments when national disasters or a shock of one kind or another has galvanized Japan and marked the beginning of a new era. There was, of course, the forcible opening of the country at gunpoint in the mid-19th century, wartime defeat in 1945, both of which were followed by decades of remarkable growth and creativity and resurgence. And I wasn't alone in this. I remember talking to colleagues about this and wondering whether this terrible disaster might turn out to be the thing that could force Japan out of its funk, the political and economic funk into which it had slid over the previous 20 years since the end of the bubble economy. It hasn't happened. Plenty has changed in Japan since 2011, but if anything, the country has shed confidence rather than regained it and is less at ease with itself than it was before the disaster. So the question is why? Partly it's to do with external factors, the pressures from rising China, North Korea, the politics of the United States in the past few years hasn't helped in making Japanese feel more secure. But it also has a great deal to do with Japanese politics. It's early to be passing judgment on Mr. Suga, the new prime minister, but certainly Shinzo Abe, his predecessor, was a leader who was elected by large majorities repeatedly in elections, despite the fact that many people were anxious and disapproving about some of his key policies and his ideological positions on nuclear power, on changes to Japan's long-standing security posture, on the notorious history issues relating to the Second World War, the comfort women, Yasukuni Shrine, and on constitutional change. There was organized opposition. There were big anti-nuclear demonstrations. The biggest one in Yoyogi Park, close to where I am now, was 100,000 people. And these were big by Japanese standards, but they were small by international ones, particularly when you consider what had happened. 3 nuclear reactors had melted down as a result of extraordinary corporate and official incompetence. If that had happened in Western Europe, you would have 1 million people on the streets, I have no doubt, for weeks. So the question is why? Why is there this disconnect between grassroots political sentiment and the results of elections? Why does Japan not have a more dynamic democracy? Because all the mechanisms are there. The moving parts are in working order. You have democratic elections, political parties, a constitution, independent judiciary, and a free press. And yet a genuinely competitive multi-party system has still not emerged. Why is that? The answer is complex, and it's one for historians like Nadine rather than reporters like me. But I suspect that it is connected to those traits which seem to be such a strength in the immediate aftermath of the disaster. And let me explain what I mean. When the wave came in and destroyed their homes, people in Tohoku organized and mobilized and got on with it because they didn't really expect official help. In Europe or the US, if something comparable would have happened, people would have been demanding to know, where is the government? They would have been whinging. That's what people do. At the time in Tohoku, low expectations of the government were an asset. They were a spur to self-confidence and resilience. But in the long run, low expectations of politicians are corrosive to a democratic system. This isn't universal, and there are, of course, in Japan, many people who are deeply engaged politically, but it is nonetheless common in talking to Japanese people about parliamentary politics to encounter almost a shrugging attitude, a certain amount of disgust, but above all, resignation about politics, certainly no anger, little sense that people have a right to expect more. Politics and politicians are terrible, people say, but what can you expect? It's almost as if politics itself is a natural disaster of which Japanese people are the helpless victims. And when that attitude is widespread, it's less likely that politics will change and evolve. Whatever else they are, in terms of physical and human damage, natural disasters are richly metaphorical. Storm, landslide, wave, we use these terms figuratively more than we use them literally. 10 years on, the physical damage of the tsunami has been largely fixed. The psychological damage has not. That's another question which we can perhaps go on to discuss. Preparedness has, I believe, been improved. If it happened again, things would be less bad than they were then. But figuratively, Japan is stricken by a sense of insecurity about the metaphorical disasters that it faces. These are the long-term, extended tragedies of lost opportunity and unfulfilled potential. The Japanese economy is still beset by a sense of drift. 75 years after the war, Japan is still in many ways alienated from its near neighbors, China and Korea, and that really is a tragedy that is unlikely, I believe, to be put right by Mr. Suga. And then there's the demographic crisis, the so-called silver tsunami, in which an ever-aging population and a shrinking younger population is creating both a social and economic crisis. And finally, as I've said, there's one of the biggest tragedies is the failure of Japan's political system to generate a dynamic two-party system, even after all this time. I'll leave it there for now, and perhaps we can pick up on those discussions a bit later.
Thank you, Richard, for your insightful reflections. If any of our attendees have questions for Richard, be sure to share them with us in the Q&A box. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Mark Pendleton, social and cultural historian at the University of Sheffield's School for East Asian Studies. Mark has written widely on the 1995 Tokyo subway gassing and how it is remembered politically and culturally in the context of post-war Japan through various forms of life writing and memorial practices. Through developing his doctoral research into a book manuscript, Mark's latest research projects have come to focus on modern ruins and industrial heritage in Japan, as well as on queer LGBT literary figures in post-war Japan. We are thrilled to have him join us today to discuss the relationship between memory and disaster in the context of the armed attack, explaining how such traumatic events manifest into memorial practices. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Ollie. And thanks very much for the invitation. It's good to see Richard and Nadine as well, and Simon. I guess I don't really work on natural disasters. And so when I was originally talking to Ollie about this, I started to think a little bit about how the work that I've done on things that are certainly calamitous, destructive events and processes might relate to this kind of concept of disasters. And I was starting, I guess, initially with some of the critical geographical work around the concept of natural disasters, which I think perhaps Nadine touched on, and certainly I noticed that Chris Hood dropped something in the chat as well while you were talking there. And really, I guess it's that question of, is there any such thing as a natural disaster after all? And I've got a quote here from the website of the No Natural Disasters Campaign Group, which says, if we recognize and accept the standard definition of disaster as a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or a society at any scale due to hazard events, interacting with conditions of exposure, vulnerability, and capacity, then we must consider human involvement at the core of the event. A hazard will only become a disaster should it impact the workings of a society or a community. So, in a sense, what we're thinking about when we're talking about natural disasters are fundamentally human processes and how they interact with the kind of the world around them. And so I guess what I was thinking about really is that if we accept that hazards are disastrous, so what makes hazards disastrous is that social, economic, and cultural context in which they play out and the human agency in shaping them, then that kind of helps us to kind of sidestep some of the ways in which natural disasters get described as unprecedented or unpredictable or unable to be planned for, and so on and so forth. I guess when we're thinking about how people relate to the aftermath of disaster and how that shapes the ways in which people remember various disastrous events, we're really in quite similar territory. Memory studies, which is the field that I've spent most of my time in, is very much concerned with similar questions of the social, economic, and cultural context of remembering and the ways in which humans engage with those. So, as Ollie mentioned, in my doctoral dissertation, I was focused on the 1995 Tokyo subway gassing and the events perpetrated by members of the religious sect Aum Shinrikyo, and looking particularly at how they were being remembered over the couple of decades after that incident. And so I guess in thinking today, I was reflecting on the different linguistic effects, though, of saigai, disaster, and jiken, or incident. And I guess I was thinking a little bit about how there's a different kind of time, temporality at play. So the notion of disaster is something that is much more drawn out and wide-ranging than a jiken, or an incident, which seems to be much more defined in time. And yet I would argue that obviously the subway gassing had a similar kind of serious disruption to the functioning of a community or society that meets those definitions of disaster that I was mentioning before. So I'm going to talk, I guess, really about the subway gassing as a kind of form of disaster memory through looking at some of the writing and other production of victims groups. But just to take a quick step back for those who might not remember or know what I'm talking about when I talk about the subway gassing. On the 20th of March, 1995, several members of a religious sect called Aum Shinrikyo released packages of sarin gas across the Tokyo metro system. They killed 13 and injured over 6,000. And this is the incident, or jiken, that most people refer to when they discuss the activities of Aum. But in the months and years leading up to that event, members and particularly the senior leadership had participated or ordered many other acts of violence, including internal practices and processes that resulted in harm, targeting of perceived enemies of the sect, and another use of sarin gas the year before in Matsumoto, a central Japanese city, which killed 8 and injured over 500. There were over 200 members of Aum that were arrested, and 13 of them were executed for their roles in the gassing. And I guess a bit like Richard, coincidentally, the morning of the 20th of March was my 3rd day in Japan. So the other way, I guess I arrived in Japan about a week before Richard as a high school exchange student. And I was on the Marunouchi subway line, one of the targeted lines when the incident occurred, with my host father, a judge who was working in Kasumigaseki, the downtown heart of Tokyo government, and was dropping me off on his way to work. Now, our train was stopped, and to this day, my host family think that the only reason their father is alive is that he was on a later train than the one he would have caught, simply because he was taking me into the school that I was going to. And I guess that little anecdote really suggests some of the ways in which we can understand the subway gassing as much more wide-ranging than is often discussed. So I'm less interested really in the perpetrators or their religious motivations, and there's lots of good scholarship out there. I noticed Erica Buffelli is in the chat here, and she's one of the key scholars in that, including Ian Reeder. So what I did instead, though, was to think about kind of the archives and repertories of memory that victim groups were using to make sense of their experiences after 1995. I met with several of the victims, including Takahashi Shizue, who was the head of the Subway Gassing Victims Association. But ultimately, most of my work is focused on the forms of life writing, biography, and memoir, which kind of shaped kind of the public discourse around the gassing afterwards. Prominently, people know the Murakami Haruki kind of piece, Underground, perhaps been translated into English, of course, but there's a wide range of other material, collections of stories, autobiographies, and so on. I guess the first point to make briefly is that victims saw their writing as a political intervention against forgetting and as a tool within a wider arsenal of activism that advanced what they saw as their collective needs. So Takahashi, who I mentioned earlier, wrote this in 1997. She said, "As we approach the 3rd anniversary of the incident, it may be beginning to slip away from people's memories." And why was that significant? I mean, I guess at that point, victims of the subway gassing were fairly much on their own. So perhaps in a little bit of contrast to the way Richard describes what happened in Tohoku, that people expected some support, and that was not forthcoming. There was no compensation scheme. Long-term effects were quite serious for some of the people involved, and so on. So part of what Takahashi and others were doing with their life writing activities was to really kind of form a way of intervening in that public discourse, which had been very much shaped around Orm itself and the perpetrators. So trying to kind of present a different narrative of what had happened on the 20th of March. And in doing so, they deployed kind of various strategies to kind of create essentially a relatable victim that people could see themselves in. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So in those early years after 1995, Takahashi had tried to form connections with victims of crime groups overseas, traveling to the United States to look at frameworks of victim-centered justice, while also drawing on domestic context. So I've written a little bit about that, and I'm happy to talk about that in the chat, but I'm not going to focus so much on that. I think what's interesting domestically is that there are lots of traditions of life writing and autobiography in a range of different forms in Japan, which you can see kind of coming through in the work that they're doing as well. And that ranges from everything from kansobun, which we've all, anyone who's spent time in Japan will experience, the kind of immediate reflections on what's happened that day in a school setting or something else, to more formalized models as well. So the early publications that these groups were putting together also involved a range of different support structures, including an editor whose name was Aoki Yumi. And she, I think, interestingly talks about the subway gassings within the context of her own childhood memories, and particularly the reading of a book by Osada Arata about children's stories from Hiroshima when I was small. And this is what she says. She says, "I've not known war or nuclear bombs, but in order to develop an understanding of that cruelty, that pain, that intolerableness, I read Osada's book over and over again as a child. Swamped as we are by coverage of the incident, the subway gassing incident, through television and so on, books function to keep the voices of victims alive for future generations. And that's why I came to be involved with this incident." And in Aoki's writing, I think we get a sense of one of the devices deployed fairly consistently in narratives of victims across time. The idea that these were innocent victims of external violence imposed by the more powerful, a similar kind of experience to war or nuclear weapons. And narratively, victims often deployed proximity as a structuring device, so essentially how close they were to the incident. And that functioned both to reinforce the randomness of the violence and innocence of the victims, but also to draw readers into their own potential exposure in an imagined, slightly alternative historical timeline. And that itself is a device that can be traced to narratives of writing that emerged after Hiroshima and Nagasaki and became very prominent in post-war Japanese society. So John Whittier Treat has documented this, noting particularly how much early Hiroshima writing documented proximity to ground zero. This is what Treat said. He said, "There's meaning in language as greater distance from the silent epicenter parallels the greater ease with which the victims of nuclear war can speak of the fact of that day. And there's meaning in the multitude of other ways the survivor of atrocity may seek to reconcile experience, memory, guilt, and rage with and against those inherited cultural systems of mediation incongruent with such lived reality." Now, over time, the category of hibakusha became much more expansive, stretching beyond those very directly affected by the nuclear weapons and into a potential universal victim of nuclear weapons. So Treat has said, "The people of two cities were, and some still are, forced to live in a compromise, a state of both life and death at the same time, that fate is a consequence of having barely survived a deliberate and methodical human plan to eliminate them, but that we potentially all face the same destiny." And Lisa Yoneyama has also discussed various survivor writings and storytelling groups, noting that the memory work of these groups relate as they narrate the moment of destruction to the other dimensions of life that are equally constitutive of them as social beings. And really that is a very common feature of the subway gassing writing as well. I'll just give you one example from 1997. This is from a young woman who was in her 30s. She says, 2.5 years ago, after the incident, there are things I'm forgetting. Even though I think something will definitely not be forgotten, bit by bit, I forget. My friends say to me, as you forget, the pain diminishes, so you should just keep on living. Maybe they're right. And as this woman's story unfolds, she talks about stories of ski trips and muscle aches that remind her of her lost husband, of trips to court trials, and really it's her loss of that day that's remembered through her changed but continued life. And many of the stories in those first victim-generated volumes all follow a similar pattern. In longer autobiographical texts by victims, we can see the emphasis on relatability even more starkly. So in books by Takahashi, who I mentioned before, the Matsumoto victim Kono Yoshiyuki, and the father of another of Orm's victims, Oyama Tomoyuki, the focus is less on proximity to that day, or the ground zero, if you like, of exposure, and more on a whole life narrative that, that has been disrupted by the actions of others. And those transformations play out for the authors in different ways, but in all of them, the violent disruption of their encounter with Orm serves to construct their life stories in a way that readers can relate to, a very normal life disrupted by the abnormal. And that abnormal and disruptive nature of the violence helps to explain some of the ways in which their post-incident lives have also become atypical and in some cases politicized. And in the work that I'm trying to finish off now, as I finally get around to writing this book, I'm talking a lot about this kind of idea of victim time and how that kind of functions in really two distinct ways. You get kind of people like Takahashi who are very interested in a distinct before and after, with the incident marking that kind of critical cutoff point. But for many others like Kono and Oyama, there's a much more disjointed and disrupted chronology where kind of, things move back and forth in time. There's not a very clear distinction of how the kind of before and after are differentiated. And part of that is about kind of the ways in which people understand the normal. So in many ways, they are reflections of experiences of post-war Japan that people see as universal. Television is often referred to, sports spectatorship, family, the ubiquity of corporate work. And in many ways, that's kind of common across all of them. All right, I know I'm kind of short on time, so I think I'm just going to kind of come to the end because I know, and with a few reflections, I think the scholar of memory, Richard Lloyd-Parry, argued a couple of decades ago that memory complicates the rationalist segmentation of chronology into then and now. In memory, the timeline becomes tangled and folds back on itself. And so I guess what I would suggest in the context of the Orm victims is we see that very prominently as well. There is a kind of real kind of disruption of time. Victims are not attempting to create a chronology that marks their experiences as historically true, a singular narrative perhaps, although they do draw on forms of documentary evidence throughout and on prominent markers of post-war Japanese society to help make their stories relatable. But instead they present time that's displaced, dispersed and disrupted. And in a sense, what that does is it tries to, I think, suggest to readers or create a kind of experience as instinctively or affectively true, something that people kind of connect to on a different kind of level. And it's, I think for me anyway, that relationship between time and affect that renders narratives relatable and therefore believable. So I'm going to pause there, but I guess the point really in what I've been talking about today is to kind of get us to think a little bit about how memory kind of has functioned in Japan historically and through various cultural forms. And I think the kind of takeaways for me really is that, memory is always about kind of the way in which we relate to the past through the present. So that is necessarily going to be reflected by the changing political kind of context that Richard is talking about. In the case of the subway gassing victims, they shift very dramatically in their political orientation after the events of 9/11, when they start to see themselves much more as victims of terrorism. And again, after the end of the conclusion of the criminal trials a couple of years ago and the executions of several of the perpetrators. So, when we're talking about disaster memory, I guess, we might want to, in the discussion, talk a little bit about what we mean by those kind of two terms. What is a disaster in the context of 20th century Japanese history, and what are the forms through which the memories of those disasters is manifest? So I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Mark. We were hoping to start a Q&A, but we haven't seen any questions come through just yet. While we wait for some, I have one just coming now from Matthew Lowton. He says, thank you both for fascinating talks. You mentioned that the low expectations for government disaster response was a spur for the admirable societal response following 3/11. However, incompetent response to disaster is often argued to be one of the key factors in the ultimate collapse of the DPJ government in 2012. do you think that this is a case of the DPJ failing to meet an already low bar, or do you think that the disaster response was an overstated factor in the fall of the DPJ, and was a similar societal response seen in the aftermath of the Hanshin earthquake? Richard, would you like to respond to that first?
Sure, yes. Can you hear me? Yeah. Yes, I mean, I think that the disaster was the death blow to the DPJ government. It was a prolonged death, but it would have been very hard for them to recover from that. But I don't think that was the only thing that was wrong with them. I mean, they quite quickly after election in 2009 gave the impression of being divided and in many ways incompetent. I mean, Mr. Hatoyama, who's the first DPJ prime minister, didn't have what it took to be a national leader at all, I don't think. He really didn't know what he was doing. So it wasn't the only thing. I think an LDP government would have weathered it better, not necessarily by making better decisions from the point of view of the victims of the population, but by handling the politics better, because that's what the LDP does. As for 1995, yeah, I'm trying to remember now. Mark may remember better than I. I mean, then of course the LDP was in power, but in a coalition with a socialist prime minister. So, you know, although there was discontent and many criticisms of the government after that, it was basically absorbed by old Mr. Murayama, the leader of the Socialist Party, who was then prime minister in this strange coalition arrangement that had been developed. And that was one of the things that contributed to the demise of the Socialist Party. It was possibly one of the lesser things, and enabled the LDP to come back from the dead like the political zombie that it is, ever always returning from the grave just when you think it's got a stake through its heart.
Thank you, Richard. We have a question for Mark now from Christopher Hood. He says, great talks. Mark, for the sarin gas attack, are there movies rather than just books related to the attack at all? And if so, how do the families feel about them? Also, is any form of museum?
Thanks. There are lots of films. So I mean, there's a scholar out of the States called Mark Yamada who's written quite a bit about Orm films, and they range in quality, shall we say, and scope. But there is certainly a kind of a body of thought in film scholarship that argues that a lot of the production of Japan's kind of creative industries after '95 was post-Orm, in a sense that a lot of things were responding to that incident and its effect on society. I don't think, I'm just trying to recall if there's any reference to that in any of the writings that I've seen. That, as far as I'm aware, there's not. I mean, there are certainly wider references to post-war Japanese culture in various forms. Riki Dozan, the famous wrestler, is mentioned by several of the people that I've read, and wider popular culture as well, but not so much the Orm films itself. Murayama, though, you were talking about Prime Minister Murayama, Richard. He's actually relatively fondly remembered by the Orm groups as one of the few people who, in politics, who gave them some care and attention. In fact, he wrote a small piece in one of their collections about a decade later, which I thought was quite interesting in terms of he's often, I think, remembered not so positively in the kind of wider context of Japanese political life, but for them at least, he's not entirely a negative figure. In terms of museum, there isn't at this point any kind of museum to Orm victims. There is a small memorial plaque in one of the subway stations in central Tokyo, and there was at one point about a decade ago a proposal from some of the victims to create a permanent memorial to the subway gassing, and the proposal was to do that through a giant relief of Picasso's Guernica, which I think is quite an interesting association to war and the kind of experience of innocence under war, which I was touching on in the comments I made before. But as far as I'm aware, those haven't gone anywhere in recent years.
Thanks, Mark. We have a question from Lawrence Green for Richard, I believe. Richard drew some striking examples of if it had happened in Europe. And this got me thinking about national responses to disasters and crisis. Over the past year, we have seen the rest of the world have to get used to mask wearing very quickly, something Japan has been doing for a long time. Are we now in a world where we need to stop using cultural differences as a reason for not to engage in better public conceptions of preparedness globally, learning more actively from other countries where possible? And does this have to be forced top down by the government, or is there a better way?
Yeah, I think learning lessons like that from international examples of course is a good thing. Yeah, I mean, the whole thing about masks has really has revealed some cultural differences. I mean, as you all know, people in Japan have always been inclined to wear masks, especially in the winter months when people have colds and sniffles and flu and so on, the normal conventional flu, and to fend off allergies in the the late winter and early spring. And I just came back from my office on the train, and as for the last 6 or 7 months, mask wearing on the train is 100%. You don't see anyone now who's not wearing a mask. I mean, maybe once a week you might see someone looking a bit embarrassed because they've obviously forgotten theirs. But the way in which mask wearing has become politicized, almost ideological, as it seems to with some people in Western Europe and especially in the United States, is, I think, incomprehensible to people here, and really hard to understand. So yes, I mean, if this is the question, then I'm all for learning lessons like that. And Japan has the government made a point of this vis-a-vis earthquakes and tsunamis. I mean, they were very conscious about how bad it looked, that one of their many nuclear power plants had been smashed to bits by the wave and spewed poison over the surrounding countryside. It doesn't look good, particularly when you've got the Olympics coming up, or you're hoping to get the Olympics. And they've tried quite hard to make a virtue of what's referred to as resilience. And Japan is, if you would hope to get through life without being exposed to a bad earthquake and tsunami. But if you are to be exposed to one, then Japan is the very best place to be, because the earthquakes, the buildings are strong. They really are built to last, and they did in that big shake. And tsunamis are very hard to protect completely against, but by and large, the drills work very well. The seawalls and barriers in many places did their job. Remember that after the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, 250,000 people died. In Japan, it was comparable in size. The shock and the wave were comparable in size to that, but 18,000 people died, which is a terrible loss of life, but obviously a lot less. So there are lessons to be learned, and I think to some extent they are being given and received.
Thank you, Richard. We have a question from Mark from Rinku Pegu, who's asked, has revisiting the Sarin gas incident as an event to which one was witness had any bearing on your academic work?
Thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, I think it is an interesting one. It certainly, I think, was one of the drivers for me to start the PhD, in the sense that, I mean, I guess I was a little, at that point, this would have been in the mid-2000s, there was limited kind of public memory, certainly outside of Japan, of the subway gassings. And I was a bit interested in those couple of years after 9/11, why that was the case, and also why it had kind of been retrospectively incorporated into this narrative of the war on terror, even though there are quite distinct kind of origins to the group that were involved, and the responses to that. So that definitely was in terms of a driver. But I think the lived experience of being in Tokyo on that day was very much more an experience of confusion. So I don't think I have anything particularly unique to say about what happened on that day, other than I didn't know what was going on. I was evacuated. I ran around the streets of Tokyo, got lost, and ended up finding somewhere to go. But what's, I think, quite interesting in the material that I've been looking at is that becomes part of some of the narratives a decade or so after, once you start to get that kind of broadening of the kind of discourse around who is affected by the gassing. So the later collections of victim narratives in 2007-8 start to talk a lot about that, and include stories of people like, I would have been there except I got a different train that day, or and so on and so forth. So again, it comes back to that kind of, I guess, the broadening of that narrative of proximity and how people get incorporated into a framework of being associated with victimization, which moves from just the directly affected to a much wider kind of sense of the Japanese population, I think, in that decade or so, and connects to those kind of frameworks of terrorism as well, and who's a victim of terrorism.
Thanks, Mark. Another question from Christopher Hood for Richard. He says, the Western media tended to portray the Japanese response of the public to 3/11 as being positive and stoical. But what about the way in which this may have masked a tendency to not discuss or research or deal with mental health problems?
Yeah, it's a very good and important question. And this was something that I learned as I was reporting on this story, and later as I researched the book, which I wrote about it. The book is called Ghosts of the Tsunami, and this addresses that. The natural disasters, you learn when you've reported on a few of them, follow a surprisingly regular pattern. It was the same in Aceh after the 2004 tsunami. You have, at first you have this tremendous kind of shock and confusion where for a few hours, sometimes longer, you just don't know what's happened. And we need to find out what's happened. So it's established what has happened. There's been an earthquake, there's been a tsunami, it's come in, it's hit this area. And initially, because of physical destruction, there's the next thing is the challenge of getting in for reporters, but also for aid workers and government people. So then you get in and you deal with the immediate needs of the survivors. First aid needs. They have to be given water, then they have to be given food, they have to be given shelter. People are injured, need to be treated, taken out. You have to establish transport links. That takes a few more days. And then you get into the kind of intermediate recovery stage, where you're building more permanent shelters for people. And all this takes time. All these stages take time, and it depends on the place. It was all done a bit quicker and more efficiently in Japan than in Aceh, because it's a richer society with a better infrastructure and a smaller country. But then you reach a point after. In Japan, it was after about 6 months where everyone's physically fine. They've had their broken limbs treated. Everyone's got shelter. They've got enough to eat. Their kids have schools. Nobody is starving. And it's at that moment where people have a chance to reflect on what has happened. And that's the moment when the trauma and the grief and the mental anguish start to take root and to manifest themselves. And in Tohoku, in northeast Japan, it manifested itself in a very interesting and extraordinary way, which is that people started seeing ghosts. All different kinds of ghost stories were heard. Sometimes it was just people had an uneasy, spooky feeling when they went down to the sea, to the beach, perfectly understandable. But sometimes people reported seeing shapes on the beach, ghostly figures. There were the kind of urban myth type stories of taxi drivers who would stop, pick up a passenger. The passenger would say, "Take me to this address." When they got there, the address wasn't there. The house had been washed away. They look in the back. There's no one there. It was a ghost flagging down the taxi driver. That's a sort of story that's always told by a friend of a friend, you know, like the urban myths. But there were also much more concrete stories. I interviewed at length a man and a priest, and the man was, to cut a long story very short, believed firmly that he'd been possessed by the spirits, not only of human beings who died in the tsunami, but of animals who died. And the priest, this Buddhist priest who I got to know quite well, had used rituals and sutras to exorcise those spirits from him. So it took a very concrete, very direct form for some people. Now, I mean, I tell these stories in my book. Personally, I don't believe in the supernatural. I think there's always another explanation, although I'm very interested by it. And the explanation here was these were manifestations of the massive mental trauma and anguish that had struck not only affected areas, but people who were living far from the affected areas. And that anguish continues to be felt. And yes, when we went in early on and admired the stoicism and the gaman of the people in the evacuation centres, of course we were missing a very great deal. And as it always does, it came out in time.
Thank you, Richard. I felt this is a good point to raise that we have a new Beyond Japan episode out now discussing the relationship between ghost stories and discriminated histories, which explores some of these issues academically. So I encourage people to have a look at that. I think we have time for one more question, maybe, from Erica Baffelli, who says, "Thank you for your talks. A question for Mark. I liked references to temporalities and timelines, and it's very interesting how temporalities overlap and diverge in victims and former members' narratives. Takahashi-san this year declared that she will no longer organize memorial gatherings. So do you think that the 25th anniversary marked another important shift for the memorialization of the Aum Jiken for the victims?"
Thanks, Erica. Yeah, I think it's a really important point. I mean, I guess the other thing that's happened in the last couple of years, of course, is that there are other resolutions to the effects of 1995. Asahara was executed now in 2018, and the others as well. And so I wonder if it's, I mean, part of one thing I talk a bit about elsewhere is Takahashi's relationship to capital punishment and kind of the ways in which she understood relationships to justice. And I do wonder if there's something about, you know, the kind of the drivers of some kind of resolution in her work, in her writing, that are also connected to the decision that she made this year to stop the formal memorialization, in the sense that, you know, everything is kind of over, formally speaking, in terms of the criminal justice process has come to a conclusion, and so on and so forth. So I think that's perhaps part of it. And she's also not young anymore. I mean, this is the other thing. We're talking about 25 years later, and many of the victims are also elderly as well. But I mean, I have to do a bit more thinking about why that might be the case. But that's my instinct, is that it's a combination of time and also a perceived resolution, at least for some of the victims.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Richard, for your time. I think we can pass over to Simon now to wrap things up as we're approaching the end of the webinar. But thank you to everyone for joining.
Thank you, Ollie. And I'd just like to add my thanks to Richard and to Mark for two really stimulating presentations. I think the fact that we've still got lots of questions coming in, I certainly have many questions that your presentations have raised. And I think you've done exactly what we had hoped, which is sort of given us a huge amount of food for thought. This whole notion of memorialization around disasters shows that it's carrying these things, it's the impact that these things have long, long into the future. I think are really intriguing. I remember we had Akasaka Norio, who I know Richard knows and refers to in his book on Ghosts of the Tsunami, came to one of our summer schools a couple of years ago and was talking through some of the art presentations, or art phenomena that were responses to the tsunami. I was particularly struck by the telephone box on the beach, where many people were going to speak to people who had vanished as a result of this. It's a incredibly rich and I think a sort of academically very stimulating area, which benefits tremendously, I think, from an interdisciplinary approach. And I think it's one that we'll very much be wanting to carry forward over the course of the coming year. But as Ollie has indicated, I'm afraid it is the witching hour, 2 o'clock here in East Anglia, so it's time for us to sign off. But I know that everybody will want to join me in thanking Richard and Mark for those 2 talks, and also to Nadine and Ollie for all the hard work in pulling this together. Thank you very much indeed, and I hope you'll all join us again for our next interdisciplinary Japanese Studies Research webinar, which will be in early December. Thank you very much indeed, and good afternoon.